So having said all that, I will introduce our speaker tonight, who really doesn't need an introduction, Jeremy Boudreau, Head of History of Art here at the Institute, well known to many of you, and he's going to talk to us about the American sculptors in Italy in the Risorgimento period of Italian and Florentine history. So without further ado, I'll pass the word to Jeremy. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the British Institute. It's a pleasure to be back on the Wednesday cultural program. And this evening, I'd like to speak to you about several sculptors from the United States who were active here in Italy in the middle of the 19th century. And the title of this talk, Omnium Gatherum, American Sculptors in Risorgimento, Italy, was not meant to scare you away. Omnium Gatherum is simply a fancy term for a motley crew. And the title slide that I've given you here is a thumbnail of a photograph that survives from one of these sculptors, whose name was Harriet Goodhue Hosmer. And you can see her here in the courtyard of her Rome studio in the year 1867, together with local assistants. And before we talk anything about her life, or her art, I think that we can deduce a few things from this photograph. Back in the 1860s, it's clear that some people were better at holding still than others. And that the environment of a sculptor's studio was largely male. We have some important exceptions that we're going to introduce you to tonight. And this talk is very much a continuation of a lecture that was presented by my friend and colleague, Jason Arkles, for this very same program, I think about halfway through last year, looking very closely at the earliest American sculptors who came to study and continue their careers here in Florence. Those were Horatio Grenat and Hiram Powers. And what I'd like to do today is carry on with that talk and understand the legacy and the example that were left by these important American sculptors. We look closely at their biographical details, how they entered into the profession, how they were able to arrive to Italy. And along the way, we understood, thanks to Jason, what the appeal was for sculptors coming from the United States to Europe in general and Italy more specifically. We learned that, of course, still in the 19th century, the availability of quality marble for figurative carving is still pretty much exclusively centered on the Mediterranean. And here in Italy, of course, we have the famous quarries of where much of the marble employed in Roman sculpture, medieval sculpture, Renaissance sculpture, modern sculpture, still quarrying up at Carrara today. If you're here in Italy, it's very easy to get to from Florence. You can visit, you can take tours, enter into the quarries. And this is an old print that was colored, but what looks like an avalanche of snow here on this mountainside is actually the marble dust from centuries of quarrying this important stone. We also learned through the lives and careers of Horatio Grenat and Hiram Powers that the other major appeal for artists coming to Italy was the ample supply of workmen. Sculptors are sometimes thought of as being kind of solo artists working by themselves, but the bigger the project, the more hands get involved. And not only do we think about the sort of logistics and studio practices of working with bronze and casting in foundries, or working with large blocks of marble, we've got to get these things around. We often have to employ architectural frameworks and settings for those, lots of people involved. And perhaps most importantly, we learned that it was the training available with the great leading figures of the grand manner or the grand movement practicing here in Italy, figures like Lorenzo Bartolini, Antonio Canova, as well as Bertel Thorvaldsen, active in Rome, but he came from Denmark. It would have been for a few ambitious Americans the sort of ultimate dream to be able to come and study under these contemporary masters here in the cities of Florence and Rome. Both by the mid-19th century were small but cosmopolitan centers. They were international. There were expat communities in both, established well before the 19th century, obviously. And we learned that the appeal for sculptors in particular came from the masses of antiquities, the piles and mountains of Renaissance sculpture, the works of their contemporary Italian artists that were on view in museums, galleries, and public spaces here in Italian cities, and that this grand manner was one that was attractive, one of the first truly international styles, not just here in Italy, but throughout the continent, the UK, and the United States, because it's this monumentality, this moral seriousness and gravity that we perceive in the work of antiquity, that beginning in the 18th century was perceived as a way to maybe make up for what had been increasingly understood as the frivolity of the Rococo and earlier court styles. And so this is a short answer as to why, and students often ask this, so be prepared if you teach this material, why George Washington is dressed in a toga in the sculpture. It is a sculpture that is based on a famous ancient work that no longer survives, but was described by ancient writers, attributed to the great Greek sculptor Phidias. And that statue was a statue of Zeus at the Temple of Olympus, of Olympia, I'm sorry. And that would have been copied in many forms. If you're familiar with the famous Jacques-Louis David painting of the death of Socrates, very similar positioning of the central figure in that painting. We also learned that it was the sincerity of portraiture, particularly in Roman busts, that was attractive and considered to be necessary for American artists to come and study very, very closely. We do, of course, have the technology of making plaster casts and shipping those across oceans, sending them to art schools. If we've got any at this point over in the United States, we start getting some important academies in the early 1800s. Most of the well-known art institutes of the United States are founded in the second half of the century, if not in the early 20th century. So looking at something like this Powers bust of Andrew Jackson, US president, dating to 1835, dressed almost as a Roman philosopher or statesman or philosopher. So there's something very universal in the application of this style of neoclassicism, and this is what these artists are hoping to bring back. The sculptors, of course, are not the only people coming to Italy, and this period of art history is particularly interesting for us in the United States because it allows us to find some interesting intersections with some of our sister disciplines. Literary figures flocked to the cities of Rome and Florence, wealthy Americans anxious to add objects to their collections or perhaps commission works of art from contemporaries here, not only Italian artists, but also their compatriot American artists working in cities like Florence and Rome, and the allure of the antiquities of these collections that seem to be never ending in cities like Rome and Florence are also described in some of the important 19th century American literature of the time. The Marble Fawn, I've got a modern copy here out from the 810s in the hallway, if anyone's interested in taking a look at this story, which was written by Nathaniel Hawthorne in 1860, is a story of three young Americans who travel to Rome, and the title of this book takes its name from an object which is at the center of the narrative, a work of classical sculpture that can be found in the Capitoline museums in Rome today, that is known as a resting satyr. It's a type of sculpture. We've got dozens of these surviving in collections throughout Europe today, but this one in particular is the work which is so beautifully described by Hawthorne, in addition to the narrative in which these Americans meet a mysterious Italian count named Donatello, who has a resemblance to this actual faun or satyr. We learn that the city of Rome itself, through these descriptions, is something that has no comparison at all in the United States. The descriptions of Roman monuments, of the districts of the city, of the collections inside of the galleries and the churches, served for many decades as an unofficial guidebook for Americans coming to Rome and traveling throughout Italy. I think I've managed to put in a modern photograph of this sculpture. Yes, I don't think that we need to work with the fig leaf anymore. There's not much there to cover in the first place, but I wanted to show you that old photograph of the resting satyr in the Capitoline to remind you that the nudity found so abundantly in classical art was also something that certain audiences had a difficult time adjusting to. And we learned, again, through Jason's presentation on the work of Hiram Powers, that one of his most important sculptors, the so-called Greek Slave of 1844, after touring here in Italy and in Europe and making its way to the United States, caused a scandal and a sensation. One of the earliest works of a full nude figure to be publicly displayed in the United States, and one that also very quickly developed a local meaning. And we know that these subjects from, this isn't even an ancient subject, the Greek slave in Power's original idea was meant to represent a young woman who is forced into slavery following one of the battles of the Greek War of Independence in the 1820s. So it's very much a contemporary event. And this is something that we understand as being a salient characteristic of this sort of art, drawing from classical narratives, the narratives of ancient Greece and ancient Rome, in order to perhaps suggest a parallel to current events, to draw similarities between the ancient past and our own time. This is a photograph of Hiram Powers that we actually have here in the British Institute Library archive behind me. That's part of the Susan Horner library collection. And in her manuscript diary, we can see him here with a study of the upper section of this figure on a pedestal. These contemporary works were many times just as fascinating to visitors as the Renaissance or the classical works that the artists themselves came to study so closely. Elizabeth Barrett Browning wrote a sonnet devoted to the sculpture, The Greek Slave, and I will read out the old thing because I think this is a great little sonnet, just to give you an idea of how the projection, of contemporary society, a contemporary way of thinking, can be placed on these works of art, even if they themselves draw on ancient example. Elizabeth Barrett Browning tells us, "They say ideal beauty cannot enter the house of anguish. On the threshold stands an alien image with enshackled hands, called the Greek slave, as if the artist meant her that passionless perfection which he lent her, shadowed not darkened, where it still expands. So to confront man's crimes in different lands with man's ideal sense. Pierce to the center art's fiery finger and break up ere long the serfdom of this world. Appeal, fair stone, from God's pure heights of beauty against man's wrong. Catch up in thy divine face, not alone, east griefs but west, and strike the shame, the strong, by thunders of white silence overthrown." And this, I think, is a good example of the way these sculptures very much become a subject in the eyes of the viewer. When this work toured in the United States, it was seen as an overt abolitionist object, a work that was meant to reference the chattel slavery being contested in the United States at this time. That will, of course, lead up to the American Civil War. And these figures, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, Hiram Powers, were surrounded by members of both the British and the American expat communities here in Florence and in Rome. We'll see that Rome eventually overtakes Florence as a destination for sculptors in particular. But both Elizabeth Barrett Browning and Hiram Powers are buried here in Florence in the Protestant cemetery located in Piazza Donatello. And I just wanted to introduce the first example of a closeness and a connectedness between the literary and the artistic figures of this age. Elizabeth Barrett Browning was also friends with Harriet Gosmer, the photograph of who we began this talk with. And on the sort of convincing of the artist, Elizabeth Barrett and her husband, Robert, agreed to have their hands cast. This was shortly before Elizabeth's death. And the condition here was that Elizabeth did not want one of Harriet's sort of assistants coming to take their cast. It had to be done by her personally and directly. And so the cast, I don't think, survives. Several bronze replicas were made from that cast, this one today in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. Browning also wrote about Hosmer, and I think here it is something of a double amazement in the work of this artist. Not only is she an accomplished sculptor, she's also a woman. And this is something which probably brings more curiosity to her activity in Rome than her work itself in the case of some visitors. But this is what Browning has to say about her in 1854. I should mention too, Miss Hosmer, the young American sculptress who is a great pet of mine and of Robert's, and who emancipates the eccentric life of a perfectly emancipated female from all shadow of blame by the purity of hers. She lives here all alone at 22, dines and breakfasts at the cafes precisely as a young man would, works from 6 o'clock in the morning till night, as a great artist must, and this with an absence of pretension and simplicity of manners, which accord rather with the childish dimples of her rosy cheeks than with her broad forehead and high aims. And so this is, again, sort of a description of the personality and the character of a fiery woman who establishes herself here in the capital just before Risorgimento, or the unification and formation of the modern Italian state. And she came here, again, as we had mentioned, not only to access the vast collections of antiquities, but also training in authorship. And Harriet Gosmer was able to study in the workshop of one of the leading neoclassical sculptors of the time, the Welsh sculptor, John Gibson, whose portrait by his countryman, Henry Williams, also a long-term resident of Rome, you can see here in the Academy of San Luca today, together with one of his works, which is up at the Royal Academy in London. This is a wounded warrior, sort of a standard component of the neoclassical repertoire. There are several types of the sculpture that exist from antiquity, and there are many 19th century variations of this composition of a sculptural group. I don't think that I put any into this talk from the United States in the second half of the 19th century. But when we look at the recent conversation around public monuments, not only in the United States, but in several Western countries, that has happened in the last couple of years, there have been borrowings that was very, very common for sculptors in the 19th century to show their debt, their sort of appreciation of the sculptors of the past. This is a very classical sort of type of sculpture that we can find in many different forms. One of them, for example, is a controversial monument showing Abraham Lincoln emancipating the African slaves of the United States. It doesn't age well, right? To show an African figure sort of crouched down and subjected below some sort of heroic figure. These are the sorts of things that we're looking at very, very differently now. However, in the sculptural tradition, your ability to emulate these examples is considered the criteria for successful training in sculpture. And the workshop where John Gibson operated in Rome is just another example of this sort of pretty straightforward grand manner or neoclassical style. This one again at the Royal Academy in London, where he worked in Rome was the former space of the great artist of Copenhagen, Bertolt Thorvaldsen. And spaces of this gallery had also been used by Antonio Canova earlier. And taking a look at this painting, which represents an important papal visit to the studio a couple of years before the painting was made, we can see here that for sculptors, and maybe if you imagine something like a painter's studio, you're lucky if you've got some good light. Maybe some ventilation is good if you're working with oils and turpentines and these sorts of things. But in terms of sculpture, you need much larger space, not only because of the scale of the objects that you're making, but these studios also functioned simultaneously as a workplace and a showroom. So you've got to be prepared to have guests coming in and looking at the works that you're making, looking at the opportunity to perhaps commission a new work from the very same gallery or studio. And this was the environment that Gosmer found herself in. And this is kind of par for the course, I think, in the artistic tradition, working very closely in the style of her British teacher. Here are two examples of another very common sculptural type, in this case, a resting shepherd or a resting fawn or a resting satyr, one of these sleepy looking male youths, usually barely dressed, perhaps on some sort of tree stump with other elements worked in around the base. But this would have been one of the types of figurative poses that would have been expected for artists to be able to master if they want to go on and work on any other sort of official commissions, especially for governments. In the case of this particular artist, she was recognized in terms of her talent and her abilities, not only by Elizabeth Barrett Browning, but also by several families of the British aristocracy. She produced works also for European nobility, and these works typically traveled and toured throughout Europe before making their way to the United States. And one of the things that was commented on, not only about Hosmer, but several other women working in the field of sculpture in Italy at this time, was that they were defining a place for themselves within a field that had been typically defined by men. These are the earliest American sculptors of their gender, women, to receive official public commissions. We'll take a look at a couple of them in important East Coast cities, but the sort of making the way through the traditions, reading about the way great artists of the past had been trained, how they arrived to greatness. This would have been very much accessible to someone like Harriet Hosmer. Not everyone was so impressed with her. Henry James of Boston, who incidentally is another important figure when we think about the enthusiasm for traveling to Italy from the United States. 1875, we have an important publication called Roderick Hudson. And this is the story of a sculptor who, thanks to the patronage of a well-to-do citizen of Massachusetts, Rowland Merritt, is brought over and financed to study the art of marble carving here in Italy. It has a tragic end, I won't spoil it for you, but these are the sorts of narratives and stories also within the literary canon that are adding to this appeal to travel and come to Italy. The best books of Henry James, it said, also take place in Italy. His Italian Hours of 1909 is a series of reflections of his extensive time spent here in Italy. And he also went on to write a biography of one of the most important American sculptors working in Rome and working out of the Palazzo Barberini, of all places, William Wetmore Story. And it's actually in the biography of Wetmore Story that Henry James refers to Harriet Hosmer, together with other women working in marble sculpture in Rome at the time, as the white Marmorian flock. And I don't think that that sounds particularly complimentary, but the name stuck. And for years after this sort of reference, this is how this group of women were referred to collectively, operating in, again, what was perceived by most very much as a man's world, figurative large-scale marble carving and bronze casting in Rome. This is one of the mature works of Harriet Hosmer. It is I don't want to say an ancient theme, it's an historical figure, Zenobia, who was the empress of the Palmyrene Empire based in Syria that came under the control of Rome in the second half of the 3rd century. And that culminates basically with this empress being brought to Rome in chains, where she is killed. And this is another good example of the type of object that would have been very easy for additional meanings or perhaps underlying meanings to be extracted from. Another chained woman, in this case, very nobly robed, certainly taking, as an example, the antiquities that Hosmer could enjoy on visits to the Vatican sculpture collections or those at the Capitoline. And this was one example of an artist really sort of finding her roots here in Rome. Many people thought that this was a work about emancipation or the abolition of slavery or the events that were really defining this generation of American thinkers. But it was actually having to do with what was happening here in Italy. Let's remember that the formation of the modern state is not officially recognized. It's sort of a long extracted process known as the Risorgimento. And that Risorgimento is embodied in 4 wars of independence. The first 3 happening in the middle of the 19th century, and the final War of Independence, considered by Italians our entry into the First World War. This is what's going to give us those borders up in the area of Trentino Alto Adige. That does not happen until the 20th century. So it's really in this moment of the 1840s, 1850s, and 1860s that a sentiment for nationalism, for unification, is growing here in Italy. I think we've discussed that in previous talks where we've looked at how the local art, especially in painting in 19th century Italy, celebrates, if not mythologizes, the important characters and events of Italian Risorgimento. For Harriet Hosmer, this figure of Zenobia in chains was a reference to Italian unification and the cause for liberty being asked for also by the people of the peninsula. This was a dramatic political change. I'll just remind you of the states that occupied the Italian peninsula. Before the expansion of the Kingdom of Sardinia, we will have to wait until 1866 to see Venice and the Veneto freed from Austrian rule, and we will have to wait until 1870 to see the last of the pontifical state come under control of the new national government. But this is, again, a period that many of these artists are living through. And if we think about Florence also serving as the capital of this newly formed kingdom after Turin, just before going to down to Rome, where we hoped we would be able to set up a capital all along, from 1865 to 1871, Florence itself was the technical capital of this newly formed state. So the exchange between Florence and Rome also is an important thing to consider if we think about the movement of foreigners from Lazio into Tuscany. Let's remember that this coincides also precisely with the lead up to the conflict of the American Civil War, lasting from the spring of 1861 to the spring of 1865, with an important historical event towards the beginning of that conflict, the Emancipation Proclamation delivered by Abraham Lincoln, effectively abolishing slavery in the United States. When we look at the artists who are traveling to Italy to have access to antiquities, traveling to Italy to have access to superior materials, traveling to Italy to receive expert instruction. They are, however, going to be working constantly to furnish spaces back in the United States with works of art on a monumental scale, ennobling public sculptures, sensitive personal portrait busts of important members of society from these areas that they came from. And they are going to very much leave that legacy in the United States. When we think about the impact of Italian art history, and contemporary art for these figures, this really is the foundation of American monumental sculpture. And I'd just like to take a look at a few works from the artists that I've listed to you here, together with their areas of activity, either in Florence or in Rome, to think about how this neoclassical movement, this European phenomenon, is translated into an American dialect by these early pioneers. The work of art, for example, that I showed you along with the list is one that anyone who has visited the Capitol, Washington, D.C., may have seen, may not have been able to see it very clearly. I think that there is a replica down in the sort of the lobby and the entrance to the U.S. Capitol. But this was the allegorical figure of freedom that was commissioned to adorn the dome of the U.S. Capitol. And this project was begun way back in the early, late 1840s, 1850s, before the actual conflict of the Civil War really breaks out. Jefferson Davis at the time is actually on the committee for the decorative program and the construction of this building. And it seems that the early version supplied by this figure of freedom, which you can see here, has been quite Americanized. There seems to be something of a feather headdress here, the stars of the flag, and perhaps maybe some idea of native clothing here in the robes around this figure. The original designs and drawings that were submitted by the artist Thomas Crawford had this figure dressed with a liberty cap. And if you're familiar with that term, a liberty cap is a feature that we find in ancient sculpture to denote a liberated slave, sort of a small cap with a piece that sort of comes out the front like this. Jefferson Davis was outraged and demanded that the composition and the details of the sculpture be changed, and the original casting gives us the present result. So there is, again, sort of a conflict in the United States in terms of how this neoclassical style is used to articulate the authority of the government, to celebrate the values, of these democratic institutions, and that is constantly being fed in, again, as we had mentioned, by the literary figures, the popular novels of the time, and the way in which neoclassical style is adapted to contexts that are specifically American is where this starts to get interesting. I'll remind you of a couple of important stories which look at the indigenous history and culture of the North American continent written in the 19th century, starting with James Fenimore Cooper's Last of the Mohicans. I'm sure if you've not read the book, you might have seen a film that was made based on this novel back in the 90s. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, The Song of Hiawatha, an epic poem looking at the trials and tribulations of a Native American warrior or chief. These were the narratives that also enlivened the imaginations of Americans and international readers. And when we look at the effort to communicate the stories and the narratives of these specifically American novels or poems, again, I'm not sure if it ages so well. This is an example, again, from Crawford. The Dying Chief Contemplating the Progress of Civilization, this one from 1856, taking very much the cue from a wounded soldier, a dying warrior, the sorts of figures that we find sort of stuck into the corners of the pediments on Greek temples, right? We've got to give them some kind of reclining or prostrated position in order to fit them into those spaces. This would have been the type of work that Crawford was able to observe and study closely here in Rome. And in this case, we can see that compositional tradition being given over to a purely American subject. I don't think that these things age well, again, as I said. Contemplating the progress of civilization, I'm sure that in the time and the mind of Thomas Crawford, the progress of civilization was considered the expansion of white culture into the territories of these indigenous peoples. I think that it's maybe a bit safer going with some of the monuments that were meant to commemorate the establishment of the country and its founding fathers. In Boston, Thomas Ball, after studying here in Italy extensively, was commissioned to produce this impressive equestrian bronze of George Washington, which adorns the public garden, Boston Common. And we also have the memorials to soldiers, veterans, and other armed forces really beginning to sort of take form in this period. These artists who had studied and trained in Italy bring that monumentality of what they had seen here back to the United States with them. Here you can see Randolph Rogers' monument to the soldiers and sailors in Kennedy Plaza in Providence. Emma Stebbins, another female sculptor working in Rome, a friend of Hosmer and others, is considered to be one of the most successful and recognized of these women artists working in Rome in her own day. She was one of the earliest women sculptors to receive official public commissions in US cities, including this monument to the educational reformer Horace Mann that can be found still today outside of the Massachusetts State House in Boston. And she is also the author of perhaps what is one of the most well-known landmarks in Central Park in New York, and that is the fountain adorning the or the angel adorning the fountain of Bethesda Plain in Central Park. And this is a space of the public park that was arranged to really showcase a fountain that was fed with waters of the recently completed Croton Aqueduct. So I think this is very reminiscent of what the popes were doing in Rome back in the 17th century. Sort of get an aqueduct working, you've got to have fountains all around town to show that you've done that. And this was a sort of a complex project to provide a pavilion and access to the fountain. But the bronze casting of the angel, known popularly as the Angel of the Waters, is one of the most popular landmarks in Central Park still today, and one of the earliest official public commissions extended to a woman sculptor. William Wetmore Story, considered by many to be sort of the leading figure. Again, he lived a wonderful life working out of a space rented in the Palazzo Barberini. He was visited by the most important American travelers to make their way to the city of Rome, received commissions right up to his death, had a long, extensive career, including this monument to Joseph Henry, one of the founders of the Smithsonian Institute that you can find in Washington, as well as a mythological subject, or in this case, a figure from a Greek tragedy, Medea. This is found in the Atlanta Museum of Art in Georgia today. And the bronze works, we can imagine, have perhaps several replicas produced even on a reduced scale for posterity, but these marble works, all of the sculptures that we've looked at, very few of them were produced in one edition only. You would make dozens of them and you would sell as many copies of them as you can. So if you've seen any of these works and they look familiar to you, but you don't remember going to those museums where I'm showing you here on the slide, chances are there are variations of these sculptures throughout the United States and perhaps even throughout European collections. One of my favorite sculptors of the 19th century, who also made a name for herself following her success studying and practicing in the city of Rome, is the African Indian sculptor, Edmonia Lewis, who you can see represented here in two photographs. One who had, despite all odds sort of working against her, established herself as a prominent figure within this white Marmorian flock of female sculptresses in Rome, working very much at the time where the efforts of the Union to keep the country together are now the subject of memorial busts, memorial large-scale sculptures out in public spaces. This is a bust of Colonel Robert Gould Shaw, who had led the first African-American unit of the Civil War from Massachusetts down to the front. And these are the sorts of contemporary figures, politicians, military figures, who are often featured as the subjects of these classically inspired marble busts. But before you get there, again, you come to Italy because you've got to study the masters, you've got to study the antiquities, you've got to study even the great Renaissance masters, as Edmonia was able to do in Rome. That's demonstrated here by a small scale copy of the famous Moses of Michelangelo, which is found in the Church of San Pietro in Vincoli. This was one of the few figures that Michelangelo had completed in the 15 teens, designed to adorn the ambitious tomb of Julius II. That was a project extended to Michelangelo. He never really gets that together while Julius is alive. The family sort of chases him down decades later and asks him to make a much smaller version in the Church of San Pietro in Vincoli, and that's where the Moses can be found today. It would have been accessible to someone like Edmonia Lewis as well. This is an excellent copy that we can find by her hand today in Washington. And I just wanted to compare a work of perhaps someone who was considered to be really sort of at the top of the game, William Wentmore's story, his Cleopatra, together with Edmonia Lewis's interpretation of the same figure with a slightly more specific subject here, the death of Cleopatra. Lots of sort of chained and dying women in these sculptures. And again, that's not because we enjoy looking at chained, dying women in pain or sort of breathing their last breaths, but they are very easy to sort of entertain as an allegorical reference to, again, something underlying, perhaps a political event. In this case, I'd like to think that Edmonia Lewis was looking at the figure of Cleopatra specifically as an African woman of power and tragedy, from which she was directly inspired. Also, her Indian heritage, being born to a Chippewa or Ojibwe mother, has a place in her art that survives. We had referenced some of the popular novels and poems treating Native American themes in the 19th century. This is Edmonia Lewis's portrait of Longfellow, which is at the Walker in Liverpool today. And several of her smaller works were inspired by the characters of his story of Hiawatha and his bride Minnehaha. There is a bit of a tragedy here, so I don't want to give anything away. But when we look at these objects, again, they are on one hand neoclassical, and on the other hand, they are specifically American. There is no context for this in European art that Americans can come to look at. They've got to sort of develop this themselves. And whether or not sculptural groups or sculptural types are a way for them to get started, looking at something like Indian combat in Cleveland today, I'd like to think this is probably inspired by our wonderful John Bologna Sabine group here in the Piazza della Signoria. Perhaps it was inspired by a classical antiquity in Rome. Certainly the marriage of Hiawatha has parallels in the ancient canon. And this is the beginning of a rich sculptural tradition in the United States. Again, on one hand, drawing on European tradition, on the other hand, becoming something of its own. This is a work by an artist named Larkin Goldsmith Mead, who had studied both in Florence and in Rome and worked here. And I just want to show you how closely this bust, which is not sort of identified as a bust of Napoleon, it's sort of identified as an ideal, which is a popular term for sculptors and painters of neoclassical tradition. After you've come to Italy and you've gone to all those museums and you've looked very closely at all those sculptures and you've listened to everything that your master has told you and you've done some work and practice in the actual art of marble carving, it is your time to make an ideal piece. Everything that you've learned is supposed to go into this. This is sort of like a dissertation piece, right? Taking all of those facets and aspects of ideal beauty and sort of putting them into one object. So whether or not we consider this to be a direct copy of Antonio Canova's classicized portrait bust of Napoleon, or perhaps a more generic amalgamation of the features and ideal characteristics of male portraiture from classical antiquity in general, it shows us that the collections of Florence are still just as important as those of Rome when it comes to accessing these materials. Goldsmith Mead is the sculptor and architect who will eventually be given the charge for the design of the tomb of Abraham Lincoln following his death. You can still find that monument in Springfield today, designed based around a central obelisk, an effigy figure in bronze of Lincoln in the center, and battling groups representing Union forces in the war over which he presided. Maybe a more benign example and almost comical example of the way that neoclassical sculpture can be found even in the heartland of the United States is its application to, again, specific geography. This is a work by Mead that can be found in the City Hall of Minneapolis. And it is a representation not of the Tiber god or the Tigris or the Euphrates. This is a river garden. If you've been to the ancient collections in Rome, I'm sure you've seen at least one of these, sort of lying down, typically having some sort of vase from which the spring waters of a river system run forth. This is the standard way in which we find rivers personified in ancient and Renaissance art. In this case, the Mississippi River, father of all waters, is represented here with local details, including an alligator and husks of corn. So again, very much localizing that and making it specific to the American experience. This has been just an introduction and was certainly much more superficial than what Jason had looked at with the work and the lives of Powers and Greenall, but an idea that there's a larger story in which the United States as a developing nation and Italy with its long cultural tradition are connected. And I'm hoping that if you are joining us on Zoom and you might be coming from one of these cities in the United States, that you can go and look at work inspired by the collections and the legacy of Rome before you have to come over here in Italy to do so. It's much easier to do in the 21st century than it was in the 19th century. And this is also a period of history that we really enjoy teaching in our Modern Florence and Italy course, which begins on the 2nd of November. All of our monthly courses in art history that run in the afternoons. We also have evening sessions on Tuesdays and on Thursdays look at 3 centuries. So starting in November, we'll be taking a look at the art of Florence and other cultural centers in Italy from the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. So the time period that we've looked at tonight is about midway through that course. And if you're interested in learning more about that, I'd be happy to tell you. We've got a lot of great lectures and visits coming up before we take a break for winter. And if you'd like to know anything more about that course or what we do in the History of Art department, I'd be happy to let you know. Thank you for your attention. Let's see if we've got any questions or comments in the chat.
Get a little bit of light in the room, perhaps.
You can try.
So you can try. So first of all, I'll find the switches and press the right one. Yeah, not bad.
Yeah.
Well, let's take it away all the Zoom people. Now we can see what's going on. All right. So thank you very much, Jeremy. And as always, we will take questions and comments from both the room and the Zoom. If you're in the room and want to ask a question, just raise your hand and I'll bring you the microphone. If you're on the Zoom and would like to make a question or comment, you can either put it up in the chat, which I can't see at the moment, but I can get that. Here it is. There's a chat. Yeah, put it in the chat if you like, or else just unmute yourself and say something. We'd be delighted to hear from you. So has anyone got something immediately on the tip of their tongues? If not, I'll get the ball rolling with an observation of mine. Jeremy, you showed a lot of examples of the work of these Americans who spent a lot of time in Italy, in Rome and Florence, back in the United States. Did much of what they made stay in Italy, or was it nearly all done in order to be exported? And so the corollary question was it made in Italy and sent on ships, or did they send casts and have it actually made in America?
I think it depends on the nature of the object and the commission. Small objects, for example, one of the central sort of income generating activities of sculptors in this period is portraiture, bust portraiture. So if you are working out of your studio in Rome and you can manage to produce a clay model, you can let that person sort of get back to America, and you can take your time working on the marble investment and then have that shipped. In some cases, large colossal figures, that gets tricky with transporting the finished casting. And so in that case, plaster blocks would be shipped and then cast in foundries in the United States. That was what had to be done, for example, with the figure of freedom that we find on the US Capitol Dome. The recognition of these artists, even though we do have important figures in Rome who are familiar with the work of these foreign-based artists operating in the city, we do have some of their work in collections here in Italy today, but I think it is much more for the international populations that are coming through these cities on the Grand Tour and later traditions that are going to be asking for these works. So I would say that in Europe and in the UK, you have a lot of work of these American sculptors, respectively. Italy, not as much. So it's not all just being sent over to America. You do have especially some of their smaller works and private commissions for portraits being commissioned from European patrons, and those remain in European collections today. But it depends on what sort of object and commission you're talking about.
So anyone in the room want to come up with something? No? On the Zoom? Yes, Ari, speak up.
Hello, long time no see. I've got a puppy. Anyway, Harriet Hoffner, the thing that Elizabeth Barrett Browning said about her being 22, was that when she started out in Italy? So she'd already had a previous life in America sculpting, is that right?
She had received very little training in America. Someone like Edmonia Lewis, for example, actually studied with sculptors in the United States before making her way to Rome. I think that it is basically a small number of drawings that were presented by her father and an older female sort of attendant that sort of made the journey with her to Rome. She didn't go herself to the artist. We learned that he was sitting out there having cafe at the Cafe Greco, as the artist used to do at the time there in Rome, and agreed to see some drawings. And based on the drawings, he would decide whether or not he would sort of accept anyone as a pupil. And his own writings, Gibson is recorded as saying, like, God, I wasted so much time looking at these terrible drawings of these like English young women who wanted to come and, become artists down here. And it never really led to anything much. However, when he saw the drawings of Hosner, he made an exception and allowed her to come formally to study underneath him. So I think it, again, is a case-by-case basis. One of the major benefits for women coming and studying here within these artistic environments is also the fact that much of the classical subject matter that they are forced to deal with is not necessarily covered in what would have been considered at the time, a young woman's education. So there might be a little bit behind on the classics compared to the male counterparts. And coming to Italy is a way, in a sense, of kind of catching up there. If they had not gone through sort of academic channels that men in their position would have been able to do. Did the female sculptors have access to male models? And was this considered correct at the time? They did have access to models. And it was considered correct enough here where you need models, otherwise you don't have a city full of sculptures like we do in Italy. Even that was something I think I forgot to mention. You know, you've got the labor, the skilled, you know, sort of workmen that you need as assistants. You have your training from the great artists of the previous generation, and you also have professional trained models, people who know how to model, not terrible models, but professional models. And this was something that was already accepted as a necessity for the production of this type of neoclassical art. So there was something a bit forgiving in terms of and I know that sounds really funny to think about a place like Rome being run by someone like the Pope as being a place which is more accepting to something like that. But if we consider the puritanical nature of especially, you know, sort of the East Coast cities in the United States in the 19th century, I mean, people weren't even worried about women seeing male models naked. They were worried about these women having to put on trousers in order to do something like carve marble. So there's a real sort of different way about thinking about appropriateness in terms of women entering into these professions. And one of the other things that you'll find in a lot of the diaries of these women is that, you know, they'll be asked, they'll be interviewed, you know, like, oh, well, you never got married. And I forget if it's Lewis who says this or Hosner. Look, sculpture is a full-time job, and so is being a wife. And if I tried to do both, I'd be terrible at both. I'm either going to give all of it to sculpture, or I would give all of it to being a wife and a mother. But don't expect me to do both. So there's some very advanced thinking too, in terms of, you know, their commitment to the field, their commitment to the art, as being something that does not allow them to accommodate these sort of expectations for behavior in other areas of their life.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Whilst you think of any last thoughts that people might have, I will put in my weekly reminder that for people on the Zoom, if you've enjoyed the talk and you would like to give a hand to keeping both the library and this program going, I'd be most grateful if you could make a donation of however much you feel comfortable with. And so any last thoughts? Yes, we got one in the room. I'll bring you a microphone.
Thanks very much. I just wanted to ask how the sort of political turmoil, both in America with the Civil War and also sort of periodically in Italy through this period, affects the sort of business of these artists, because presumably it sort of makes it both harder for Americans to get over to Europe, and also means a lot of them won't want to, given it sort of seems sort of dangerous, unstable place. So I was wondering what sort of repercussions, if any, that had for them as sort of artists, as businessmen and women, as well as artists. Thank you.
I don't think that it's going to interrupt their plans all too much. And when we look at these major public commissions, particularly in the North, they seem to be inspired directly by the conflict, you know, getting started. So they're investing massively in state capitals and important city halls with these sorts of monuments. They are effectively legitimizing, you know, some of the earlier abolitionists who were sort of, you know, the real pioneers in leading that way of thinking in earlier decades. And so I think that it's something that, you know, you don't have to wait for the war to be over to start investing in this kind of thing. In Italy, in terms of transportation, I feel like it only improved. You know, this is where we start getting like train tracks in Umbria finally. Like, you know, once the country unifies, we see a development of the infrastructure of the former papal states that just had never been attempted previously. We see the linking of these different territories now through an infrastructure, also of port and ship travel that was largely provided by British ocean liners, let's say. Most of these Americans were sort of traveling to Liverpool, traveling to Cork, traveling, you know, Southampton, and then sort of getting smaller ships to come into the Mediterranean, getting off either at Genova or Livorno or Civitavecchia to get to Rome. So I don't think that there's so much sort of being thrown into the works, either with the conflict of the American Civil War or with the sort of political and military events of the Italian Risorgimento. If anything, people living sort of not on the front lines would have been able to live a life practically unaffected, especially if we're talking about upper classes, sort of the elite figures of these particular societies. They're not going to have to cancel a trip to Italy or Rome, so to speak, because war broke out. You know, that's something I think that we see a steady kind of constant sort of movement through the 60s, and certainly in the 70s and the 80s, we'll see a flood of Americans. I think that they registered in up to 200,000 Americans by mid-century every year traveling to a city like Florence.
It's got long roots. The city is full of Americans again. I notice as I'm walking around, and I'm always welcome. Any more from the audience? It's just one last thought I had, or indeed from the Zoom. Yeah, here we are. Yeah.
I guess, Jeremy, it's just more about how these pieces of art now viewed under, you know, the current thinking with Black Lives Matter. Clearly in the UK, we've got issues with statues being challenged. You know, should they be displayed? And clearly they've taken the Italian workmanship, transformed it into a subject at that time, which was very relevant. But I'm just wondering, are you aware how these pieces are viewed now?
Again, as an American giving this talk, I tried to give a huge disclaimer that some of these things don't age very well. And I think that has to come in particular with the way different races as they were perceived at the time were represented. The subordinate, you know, the sort of lack of empowerment, but the beneficence of sort of instilling freedom on a previously not free person, having nothing to do with their own agency whatsoever. You know, these are things that we think about differently today. What I would say is that the statues that have been really at the center of that debate in the United States tend not to come from this period, but come from the period of the early 20th century, around the time of the First World War and throughout the Roaring '20s, when there is sort of a massive campaign to provide monuments in the southeast of the United States to figures of the Civil War conflict that represented that side of the conflict. So, you know, these sort of statues to Jefferson Davis weren't going up in 1865 or 1866, they were going up in, you know, 1922. And so I think it's within that context of the early 20th century investment in public monuments and sculpture that we have to look at to sort of understand how that period of history was used, how art was used rather, to try to not rewrite, but to recolor, you know, the specifics of that conflict.
Well, I think we're probably coming towards the end, unless anybody else has got something that they would like to contribute on the Zoom or in the room. Everyone out there on the Zoom, it's delightful to see you here. I'm so sorry you can't be with us in the room, but I hope you'll hurry back to Florence just as soon as you can. Things are opening up, and our infection rates and our vaccination rates are both going in the right directions. So let's hope it continues like that. So we'll say good night and goodbye to you. And for the lucky ones in the room, we can now have some Sonnino wine. Bye-bye, Junos.
Bye-bye.
The people in the room are waiting.